I found Jane had booked time off despite my orders. When I confronted her, she panicked, insisting, but I didn't retire. My friend, whom I will refer to as Sandy, was employed at a travel agency located in British Columbia, Canada. This was a modest, family-run establishment consisting of the owner and 3 staff members, including my friend. The entire team operated from Monday to Friday, between 9:00 a.m. and 5:00 p.m. One of Sandy's colleagues, whom I will refer to as Jane, an older lady in her early to mid-60s, had a long-standing history of being a problematic employee. Among other questionable actions, Jane consistently devised ways to take additional time off, beyond her paid vacation. To compensate for her absences, she would falsely assert she was working overtime by coming into the office during her off hours, to finish tasks, even though the owner had not requested her presence. Despite being caught in her fabrications multiple times and receiving warnings about attempting to claim unauthorized overtime, the travel agency's owner hesitated to formally discipline Jane or terminate her employment. This reluctance stemmed from the owner discovering that Jane had been dismissed from her previous job at another local travel agency for similar behaviors. However, Jane had taken legal action against her former employer for wrongful termination and successfully obtained a settlement. After a few years of Sandy's tenure at the travel agency, the owner decided to retire and offered to sell the business to her. Sandy accepted the proposal, taking over the agency while retaining Jane and the other employee. Just as the previous owner had feared letting Jane go, Sandy shared the same apprehension of being sued. Upon taking control of the business, Sandy implemented policies governing time off and enforced a strict, no overtime rule. Although Jane continued to attempt her antics, she found it much more difficult to succeed with Sandy in charge. Nevertheless, Jane had one remaining tactic for taking time off at her discretion. Sandy, a divorced single mother of 2 sons who were actively involved in youth hockey, occasionally left the office an hour or 2 early to attend her children's games or practices. To sidestep the necessity of formally requesting time off and facing possible denial, Jane would wait until Sandy was out of the office to book a day off whenever she felt like skipping work or had prior commitments. Consequently, Sandy would arrive at work the following morning only to realize that Jane had not shown up. Despite this happening multiple times, Sandy typically let it go since there was now a clear, no overtime rule in place. As a result, Jane was unable to claim extra hours on weekends or after work to offset her absences. She either lost a day's pay, which benefited Sandy as the owner, or it came from her remaining paid vacation days. Furthermore, with 2 employees present at the same time, the workload was manageable. Therefore, Jane's absence was not detrimental to Sandy. However, a particular incident arose when Sandy planned to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her sons to a hockey tournament. She explicitly informed both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not request time off for those dates as she needed both of them at the office while she was away. A few days after issuing the notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to handle paperwork and review the week's sales. It was during this visit that she discovered, just the day prior, Jane had booked a vacation for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas as well as a flight in her name to Calgary, where her daughter resided. Both the Las Vegas trip and the Calgary ticket coincided with the dates Sandy would be absent. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule and confirmed that Jane had indeed taken time off for the dates she had specifically stated were unavailable. Without mentioning her discovery of Jane's plans, Sandy emailed Jane stating that she would have to decline her request for time off since she had already communicated that it was not permissible due to her absence and the need for Jane at work. In a series of ongoing email exchanges, Jane responded with a blatant lie, providing an excuse about her daughter requiring some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and that she needed to travel to Calgary to assist for a few days while caring for her granddaughter. Sandy countered this untruth by informing Jane she was aware of the Las Vegas trip booked for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely about babysitting her granddaughter while her daughter was in Las Vegas, and that she still needed to deny Jane's request for time off, especially since Jane had scheduled it after being told it was not allowed. In her subsequent response, without even acknowledging that she had been caught in a lie, Jane stated she had been a loyal employee of the travel agency for several years and could not understand why she was being treated so unjustly after everything she had done for the business. Jane concluded by saying that since she did not feel valued as an employee, she had no option but to retire and was providing her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's ultimatum, Sandy reiterated that she still could not approve the days off and chose not to mention Jane's retirement threat. Sandy then consulted her accountant, who also served as her unofficial business advisor, to discuss what had transpired with Jane. Aware of Jane's previous mischief, Sandy's accountant informed her that this was the opportunity she had been seeking to part ways with Jane, and she had documented evidence. He told her that Jane had effectively resigned and that all Sandy needed to do was acknowledge Jane's retirement notification, allowing her to finish out her 2 weeks or provide her 2 weeks' wages without any additional severance payment, as Jane had not been terminated. The following Monday, Sandy arrived at the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend to serve as a witness. She gathered Jane's belongings from her desk into a box, while also taking items that belonged to the business. Since Jane was resistant to inputting client information into the computer database, this included a small box filled with index cards containing client phone numbers, addresses, credit card details, and other personal data. Meanwhile, the other employee had arrived, and they all awaited Jane's arrival. Jane came in just before 9:00, behaving as though nothing had occurred, and greeted everyone with a "good morning" as she entered. However, she appeared somewhat surprised to see Sandy's boyfriend seated across the room. Just as Jane was approaching her desk, Sandy informed her there was no need to proceed any further as she had accepted Jane's resignation. Sandy then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours worked during the current pay period, along with 2 weeks' wages as compensation for not completing her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was stunned and entered into a state of panic, insisting, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy reiterated that Jane had, indeed, retired, provided her notice, and that Sandy had documentation to support this. Jane could only respond by repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully seeking the support of the other employee, who declined to defend her. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's possessions, wished her a happy retirement, and instructed her to leave the office. Jane hurriedly rummaged through the box, noticing that the small container with the index cards was missing. She insisted that Sandy return it, but Sandy refused, explaining that it was the property of the business, contained sensitive client information, and giving it to Jane would violate Canadian privacy laws. Jane's shock quickly turned into defiance as she persisted in refusing to leave without the box. The other employee and Sandy's boyfriend began to intervene, repeatedly urging Jane to depart. Sandy then warned Jane that if she did not leave, they would need to contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend called 911 to notify dispatch of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was unwilling to vacate the premises. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived, prompting Jane to rush to the door, ranting about being dismissed and the missing box of client information. To de-escalate the situation, one officer asked Jane to step outside and share her side of the situation. Meanwhile, the other officer stayed in the office to hear Sandy's account, ultimately agreeing that Jane had no legal right to the box of client information. The other officer then returned to the office, instructing Jane to remain outside. He explained that Jane had claimed Sandy was holding her personal belongings, specifically a box of critical information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken with her elaborated on the contents of the box to the other officer, who then concurred that it did not belong to Jane. The officers collected Jane's larger box of personal items, brought it outside to her, and informed her that she needed to return home. To further aggravate Jane, the next day Sandy displayed a large sign in the agency's window congratulating her on her retirement, alongside a small announcement in the local newspaper echoing the same sentiment. As the final touch to her calculated act of revenge, Sandy ensured that, while completing the necessary government forms for an employee who quits, is terminated, or retires, she marked the box indicating, "Retired," as the reason for Jane's departure from employment. This action rendered Jane ineligible to receive unemployment insurance benefits.